again, everybody. Pastor Bob, along with Pastor Jason. Welcome to the Between the Lines podcast, where we talk about all things preaching at Tri-Lakes United Methodist Church. Jason, how are you? I know that you have been stuck at home more than most. How is it going at the Baxter household?
Yeah, it's going well. We're still getting along. Nobody has yelled or punched at anyone just yet, so we're doing fine here. So,
well, that's good.
How about you? I know you're able to get out a little bit more. You get out and go walking and stuff every day, but how are you doing?
It's been a busy time. I mean, actually, I've been coming into the church every day, and yesterday, our trustees were here working on a project, actually running power up to the crosses so that we will be able to do some outdoor worship in the near future when restrictions are relaxed. We're looking at possibility of doing drive-in worship and maybe having some people outside. So being able to have a sound system up there. And we also ordered an FM transmitter so people could actually sit in their cars and listen to the service live as they're sitting in the parking lot, almost like a drive-in movie theater kind of thing. I know a lot of churches are doing that, and but we have to get power up to the crosses because there's nothing up there. So, and at the same time, we don't want to overwhelm our neighbors with sound from speakers and things like that. So we've got to try to balance all of that. But we are making plans and progress for what will come on the other side of this, at least initially. And you know, people I think need to know that because, you know, right now we're still in this sort of stuck place. And even when the restrictions relax, doing worship indoors is going to be kind of restrictive.
Yeah, I think that's going to be a great option to be able to get outside, and it's going to be one of the safer ways for us to do it. And, you know, we're always talking about going back to our Wesleyan roots. So let's do some field preaching here and see how that goes.
I actually have that in my sermon for this Sunday, since it's Aldersgate Sunday, and talking about last year at this time, we were in England, actually a little earlier in the month, and we went to Hannah Mount, where Wesley preached outside for the first time there in Bristol in April of 1739. And it was very cool to be in that spot. And I did not imagine we would literally be in that kind of spot here this year, but that's where we're at.
Yeah. I recall when we, this is on a little bit different note, when we went and spent a summer, I did an internship in England, and we did a little bit of a Wesley tour, and there was this one museum that was talking about field preaching, and they had these little podiums that they would carry along with them because, you know, they couldn't be, you know, totally, you know, inappropriate. So even though they would preach in the field, they would have these little portable pulpits that they would take around and preach from those, at least, so that they were at least still preaching from some type of podium, which I always thought that was entertaining.
Right, because in those days, you could not preach outside. It was considered to be really gauche, very vile, as Wesley said, to preach outside of a church. And imagine what they would think now when we are online and broadcasting everywhere. That we're all televangelists now, and here we are doing our thing online. Sam and I were in yesterday and recorded Sunday's service. So, you know, that's been, I will never call it the new normal because I just don't think it is normal. I don't think it'll ever be really normal. I think at some point we will be back in a place where we can do that. But for now, it is a good opportunity. And so we've been talking a lot about modes of preaching and how we're doing it. But the question for us that we want to deal with today is about the content of preaching. And we have typically been doing sermon series for the last several years, at least since I've been here. We tend to do longer sermon series, focus on biblical books or on topical series. But you and I have had a lot of conversations about where we go from here. The pandemic has kind of given us an opportunity to rethink some things. And so we're actually really excited about our next movement, and that is not doing anything innovative. We're actually doing the opposite of being innovative. We're actually going way back in Christian history and beginning to preach from the lectionary. So talk about that for you, Jason, what that means, and tell people a little bit about the lectionary.
Yeah, so, the lectionary is really, it has somewhat of a varied history, but, it's really a means to systematically work through the text over a period of time. And so, usually it's set on a 3-year cycle, and over a 3-year period, you will ideally have gone through most of the Bible and touched on it. And so there's some real value in that discipline, in that it takes you through the text. When we're doing sermon series and other things like that, there's a real temptation and almost a centrifugal pull to keep going back to certain texts that are familiar, even to stay in the New Testament and to not preach the Old Testament adequately. And so I think as we move into this new time, it's a way to set up a systematic and an intentional way for us to actually go through the text. And I'll let you share a little bit about how the devotional guide will probably be shaped by this as well. But I think as we are in this uncertain time and routine becomes something that is harder to come by, or at least has changed dramatically, that the routine of the lectionary, even on a daily basis, and the way that can feed into the Sunday morning sermons, is going to be a powerful tool for us as a congregation in this time. So what thoughts do you have about the lectionary, and how do you see maybe this daily rhythm of using the lectionary feeding into what we do on Sunday mornings?
Well, we did this experiment with the Immerse Bible in the fall, which I think was really a great experiment, a great opportunity for people to read the text on a broad scale across multiple weeks. So reading the entire New Testament across that time. But the feedback we got from folks was that while they loved the idea, and a lot of people bought those books, right? We sold like 130 of those Immerse books, and a lot of people started Immerse, but got bogged down a little bit as they went through, because there is a lot of text, even at the 16-week level, that you have to kind of go through each day. And it's difficult, I think, sometimes to read that when you don't have the context. So the thing that we struggled with was trying to match up the sermons with the reading that people were doing. And that was really difficult. We did Mark because we wanted to focus on one book instead of trying to cover massive chunks of text each week. And I think there was a lot of success to that. We did have a lot of good things happen. We had a lot of people who went through Immerse, maybe excited about moving on to the next book. We want to encourage people to do that if they have bought that book, Beginnings. But it's interesting, the lectionary is actually kind of going to start through that here very quickly into the Pentateuch and the first 5 books of the Old Testament. So if you got those books, we encourage you, and that's been working for you, keep reading through that Immerse Bible. Use that, because that is a marvelous way to access the text. But we had a lot of people say to us, we just couldn't keep up with it. We couldn't really talk about it in our small groups because not everybody had read it. It had become more like a book club, and a lot of book clubs, like I've told the story about doing book clubs in the past where, I showed up and I had read the book, but nobody else had read the book. So that makes it a little bit difficult to have the discussion. Yep. The lectionary actually gives us not only smaller chunks of text and covering Old Testament, New Testament, Psalms, Gospels each week, it also gives us a daily rhythm of being able to do that in smaller chunks where it's easier to read daily, but also able to see how things string together over time. And not just from the textual standpoint, but also from the standpoint of the Christian year. That it's not just the text that has the rhythm, but there's an annual kind of process that we move through. So for example, we just came out of Easter, and if you follow the lectionary, you would know that we're still in Easter tide. That's the 6 weeks or so after Easter leading up to Pentecost. Pentecost Sunday is going to be the 31st of May. Before Pentecost, you also have Ascension Day, which is actually the Thursday, the 28th of May. It's usually the Thursday before Pentecost. And most of the time when we are using a series or something like that, we kind of just blow by that. We hit the big events, but we don't always hit them, like Transfiguration Sunday or Trinity Sunday or Christ the King Sunday, or all these Sundays that are part of the Christian year. We often kind of go past those. Mm-hmm. And the more that I've thought about it, the more I think that engaging those particular kinds of rhythms, both in worship and in our personal devotions, enables us to have a common experience and to follow the gospel through from beginning to end every year, so that it becomes part of who we are. So I've written for years, for the last, what has it been now? 18 years, I've written for a magazine, a preaching magazine that's lectionary based. And at the same time, I've rarely ever used the lectionary. So I have a bunch of sermons stockpiled. I'm not going to use those because they're written for the magazine. But what's exciting to me is the idea that when we use the lectionary, we're actually involved in an ancient rhythm, and we're involved in a rhythm that is shared by lots of different churches across different traditions. So there are lots of different traditions that use the lectionary. And this goes back all the way to the time of Jesus, where in the synagogue, they would have read prescribed series of texts each Sabbath day. The early church picks this up in the 3rd, 4th century. As early as that, they are using lections in their worship, right about the time that Christianity became sort of the dominant religion in the Roman Empire. We see it in the Reformation, Martin Luther and Calvin, prescribing texts and they were trying to push away from everything that was Roman Catholic. So the Roman Catholics had a prescribed set of texts. They said, well, no, we can't have that. So we have to come up with our own. And then you had the Anglican tradition, which was the Wesleyan tradition, the tradition of John and Charles Wesley. Also with the Book of Common Prayer picks up this idea of a lectionary. And I've been using that personally. I know you've been using it. So there is a daily rhythm to that. So it's actually a very ancient practice to use the lectionary, and it keeps you honest as a preacher because you have to deal with the text for that week. You can't just ignore it or blow it off. So that's what's exciting to me about the lectionary. How about you?
Yeah, I think so. I like for me, it just becomes, I know in my own personal preaching journey, and, I'm an associate, I'm not a senior pastor. So I've never had to do the week in and week out over an extended period of time the way you have. However, I notice that I have this temptation and this tendency whenever I do get to choose. And also, my specialty is New Testament, right? So all of my, the vast majority of my biblical studies and theological education has all been in the area of New Testament. So I always am sort of pulled in that direction. And so I'm excited about the lectionary because it's gonna stretch me and it's gonna prevent me from doing that. Now, of course, on Sundays when we read the lectionary, there's an Old Testament reading, there's a Psalm, there's a New Testament, right? So there is, the possibility to continue on with that, but I'm looking forward to being intentional about selecting some Old Testament texts and sort of broadening our exposure that way a little bit, and taking that journey together. I did want to add too that I think I was reading an interesting article on the means of grace and sort of how John Wesley encouraged his preachers to search the scriptures. And that was a very lectionary-based discipline that he encouraged them to engage in. And it traditionally involved reading an Old Testament passage in the morning and a New Testament passage in the evening. Or I could have gotten that backwards, but it was one or the other. But that was the rhythm that he encouraged his preachers to undertake. And it was a slow, meditative type reading, more in the direction of Lectio Divina. And so I tend to say, when you think about immerse, where you're reading these long or bigger chunks of scripture, and then you have something like the the lectionary, we tend to want to choose one or the other. And I think really to sort of have a healthy spiritual diet, we need to have both types of scripture reading in our lives. Because the thing about, one of the weaknesses, as you well know, about the lectionary is it does skip certain texts. Where when you do something like immerse, it forces you to read every single word in there. And that's a good thing. And it forces you to get more of the story in a particular chunk of time. And that's helpful. But then also we need to slow down. We need to get to the meat of the text and let that form us and, encourage us, allow the Lord to speak a specific word to us. And sometimes I think doing that slow meditative reading that the lectionary really promotes is important. And so I would still want to encourage our folks to think about a morning and evening discipline. Kind of what I've tried to rest into is I do a shorter, more meditative passage in the morning, and then in the evening I do immerse. And so I've moved on to the other books. I just started Poets right now, so I'm doing Psalms and Ecclesiastes. Lamentations is what I read last night. But for me, that's been a helpful discipline to try to have the meditative reading in the morning that's slower, and then the bigger chunks in the evening to sort of get the full scope of the story.
Yeah, I've been using the lectionary in the Book of Common Prayer, which is kind of a chapter of Old Testament, a chapter of, well, not quite a chapter of New Testament, morning and evening. So I've been in Deuteronomy in the morning and now in Ezekiel in the evening, and it doesn't skip the tough parts. Like Deuteronomy this morning was all about, when you take over a town, if it's not within this particular zone, kill all the men, but keep the women and children for yourself. But if it's in this particular zone, it's in the Canaanite zone, then kill them all. And you're kind of like, wow, okay, so that is a text we have to deal with to some degree. And the lectionary, the Sunday lectionary, does tend to skip over those sometimes. But even when I've been writing for homiletics, when you're given a specific lectionary passage and you're given 1,500 words to kind of write about this particular passage, again, context is everything. So I never skip over that stuff. I'm always trying to bring that back into play, because I think it's important. You can't just skip over that. But what the lectionary does, I think, is it focuses on the primary focus of the gospel, both contained in the Old and New Testament. So it's not so much a study text, as you said. Mm-hmm. It's more meditative. I heard it put this way, that using the lectionary is a way of getting the word out. So you use these smaller chunks of text to proclaim the gospel on a Sunday morning, to proclaim that publicly. But then you also need Bible study in order to get the word in. Yeah. So I get the word out through proclamation and even just the reading of it. So using the lectionary, if you're doing it correctly, which I think we're going to do, at least my version of correctly, and with my liturgy nerd friends, their version of correctly, is you read all those texts. So you read the Psalm, you read the Old Testament, you read the New Testament lesson, you read the gospel lesson. Even if you never address those, some of those texts in your sermon, there's still something about the word being read publicly. And our lay readers do a phenomenal job of that. Mm-hmm. Just reading the word publicly is a proclamation. Yeah. And then you're going to focus on one or more of those texts in the sermon, which is also part of the proclamation. But then we're talking about, okay, how do we add in more detailed study of a particular book, which we've done in our Bible studies, we do in our Sunday school classes, we do in all kinds of other places. So again, if you are the kind of person who's like, I really love this immerse thing, you do both. There's a tremendous opportunity for you here. But if you're not able to kind of do the longer form sort of thing, this is a place for you to start. And our weekly and daily devotional guide is going to become even more important, because as we have seen, and I want you to speak to this, but our small groups, the ones that have been most successful, have been the ones that have been kind of tied to responding to the sermon and responding to the devotional guide. Talk about that some, Jason, how that's been working.
Yeah, we had a really great meeting with our discipleship team last night, and pretty much everyone that's on that team, they're what I would call our practitioners. They're the ones that are leading our small groups, and what they discovered, with Immerse, we really wanted that. I think that was confusing, right? Because we wanted to do these transformational small groups, but we didn't want them to be study-based. We didn't want them to be a Bible study. And yet we had them reading this book, the Bible, right? This different version of it. And so it was like, is this a study? And then you're reading through it and there's confusing things in there. And so you need certain historical background. You need certain contextual things to fill in the gaps. And if you don't understand it, how do you apply it? And so I think it was really hard for that to not, there's a certain amount of Bible study that I think just needs to happen for that to take place. But when you focus on the sermon, we've provided a text, and then in the sermon, we've unpacked the literary context, we've unpacked the historical context. So you kind of provide all of that you need. And now you're able to take what that scripture was saying and unpack it transformationally for your own life. Whereas when you're dealing with Immerse, you're trying to cover all this material and there's tons of questions out there. Whereas when you focus it down to a certain passage and sort of provide the necessary background, now people can then get together in these small groups together and say, okay, what does this mean for me? How was this a word for God in my life that I'm supposed to now live out in my particular environment and circumstances? And so I think that this is a real wonderful opportunity for us to help people engage scripture in a transformative way without getting sidetracked off with, just doing a Bible study. The way I always like to characterize this is it's one thing to read the Sermon on the Mount and to be able to tell somebody that, in Matthew chapter 5, it says that I should love my enemies. It's another thing to talk about who are the enemies in my life that I need to love. And in these transformational groups, we want to move to that latter question. We can address the former part of it in the sermon and in the unpacking of the historical context. We can start to get to the, okay, now what idea, and what does this mean for me in small groups? So I'm just tremendously excited about the way that this lectionary, following the lectionary, can really provide some synergy for multiple areas of ministry in our church.
I think it is exciting in that way. And it doesn't downplay what we've done with Immerse, which I think is tremendous. And again, for those who are using it, I was really blessed by it. I thought it was a tremendous way to do it, and we'll continue to do that. But the lectionary does provide us with much more of a focus on particular pieces, and even on particular days, like this coming Sunday. The lectionary gives you different options. So it is the Annunciation of the birth of John the Baptist. It is Pentecost Sunday. No, that's the 31st. I'm talking about the 31st. But so you could celebrate either of those two things on the 31st. Most people are going to do Pentecost on the 31st. But this particular Sunday, the 24th, and I keep forgetting because I'm always a week ahead now with the sermons and all that. So this coming Sunday is the 24th. The 24th gives you multiple options. So the Ascension, which the day of the Ascension is the 28th, but you can celebrate that on the 24th. But if you're a Methodist, you can also celebrate Aldersgate Sunday or Heritage Sunday on the 24th. So it gives you some options to do that. So I've chosen to do that. So the lectionary texts that we're reading for this Sunday would have been the ones that John Wesley heard read and commented on in his journal at an afternoon prayer service at St. Paul's Cathedral on May 24th, 1738. So there's a historical connection to that. But then when we get to Pentecost, okay, now we've got the Pentecost places, but then we move into the season after Pentecost. And the lectionary is divided into 3 different years: year A, year B, year C. And those are the Sunday texts. So in the devotional guide, you're going to get the text for the following Sunday that you can read before you come to worship, or in this case, before you turn on worship. You can read those texts and be familiar with them so that you can listen for that in the sermon. But what we've also discovered is that there's a daily lectionary that's connected that takes you in between the Sundays, that the first 3 days of that lectionary kind of are echoes of what the previous Sunday was about. And the latter 3 days of the week are leading you toward the next Sunday's lectionary texts and what might be preached in the midst of that. So you get much smaller text to read each day, but it is an opportunity then for you and then for a small group to read this together over the course of a week and be able to say, okay, now we've heard the message, we've had a chance to chat about that, we have a chance to chat about some of the peripheral texts around that or some of the context around that. But also, because it's a smaller chunk, what does this mean to me? How am I integrating what I'm hearing, this proclamation, into my life? Because ultimately, proclamation that doesn't lead to resolution or change is just blowing smoke.
Yep. Yeah. What are we doing? If it's not leading to that, what are we doing?
Yeah. I mean, how many times you come out and people, will say, wow, that was a great sermon. But then a lot of people say, and we've talked about this before, that was a great sermon for my brother. But what about you? Right. So there's this opportunity for us to really think about, okay, now I'm focusing on a particular text. I'm focusing on what this message is, what the proclamation is in the midst of that. And it's the job of the preacher, I think, to kind of take that. And what it forces us to do is to go back to the disciplines we learned as seminary students. That we talk about the difference between exegesis and eisegesis. Do we read the message out of the text, or do we read our stuff into the text? Right. And topical series, anytime you hear somebody quoting lots of different scriptures in a particular sermon, just kind of, grabbing a verse here, grabbing a verse there, you can pretty much be certain that it's an eisegetical kind of sermon. Yeah. It's trying to arrange evidence to make a point that's not necessarily, the evidence doesn't necessarily lead you there. But an exegetical sermon forces the preacher to sit in the study and deal with that text in its context and only that text. That's a whole different discipline, and it's really what we're more trained to do. It's more tempting, it's more popular to do the eisegetical method, but the exegetical method really is the place where biblical study, I think, happens on a regular basis. Now, I just said all that. You are the scholar, so am I accurate with that or not?
Yeah. I think, certainly, and I'm not sure I deserve the title of scholar by any means, but I think that is, the truth of the matter is we still have to be aware of eisegesis, even when we pick a text, right? Sure. When we were in seminary, since you brought that up, that was when the show CSI first came out. It came on every Thursday night, and Stacy and I loved that show. We'd watch it. Got a little bit dark at certain times, but one of the lines, I think the guy's name was Grissom. He was sort of the main CSI there, and he would always talk about following the evidence, right? You can't come to the crime scene with your mind already pre-made up. You need to have some openness, look at the evidence, and see where it leads you. And I think that's one of the reasons I'm really excited about the lectionary, is because it frees us up to follow the evidence of the text and for it to lead us in the direction of the biblical conclusion. Not that we always have to be aware of that danger. But sometimes when we do, these topical sermons, they're great. And I think we, really try to avoid any type of eisegesis when we do that. But sometimes it does feel to me like you're trying to sort of take a text and rest it so that it fits into, what it is that you feel like you need to say and cover that day. And so this just sort of sets us free from that. And one other thing I wanted to add is, you look at the stuff that Barna has done, what the Institute for Bible Reading, the group that is promoting Immerse, I just love their heart and where they're at. They're trying to address this problem of biblical illiteracy and the lack of biblical engagement that's not only in the culture at large, but is now really, a part of the church. I don't think there's much difference between biblical engagement in the church and that outside of the church. And what we don't want to do is beat anyone over the head or shame them or guilt them for not having that in their lives. But we do want to encourage people, especially at Tri-Lakes, to engage your scriptures, to make that a part of your daily rhythm and your daily practice. And I think the lectionary helps with that, because I think for some people, to go from nothing to Immerse felt like getting up off the couch and trying to run a marathon. Whereas, and that's intimidating and it's tough. Whereas, hey, if I can start with these shorter pericopes that come out, even if it's just a chapter, right? Kind of like what you're doing with the Book of Common Prayer. Even if it's just a chapter, but these shorter pericopes, that just feels more manageable. And so I would want to just encourage people, just start, whether you're doing Immerse, whether you're doing something like the lectionary, just engage scripture. And if you have to start with the smaller chunks, no problem. That's just phenomenal that you're doing that. And so I think there's an opportunity here to increase Bible reading and Bible engagement in our congregation too, that I hope people will take advantage of.
It also helps us tremendously with planning. I mean, we sit down to try to do our sermon planning out a series. How long is it going to be? And we've experienced this when you've gotten into the midst of the series and you said, I think I've said all I want to say about that. And yet you still have 3 more weeks to go. And you're kind of like, well, I didn't really plan that very well. And sometimes it works great. Sometimes you're like, man, I could do this for 28 weeks or whatever. But it makes it difficult for future planning. So for example, when we plan worship, the choir needs to be involved, the music needs to be picked, all that kind of stuff. And so people, what are we doing 3 months from now? Well, now at the lectionary, you can say, well, I know what I'm doing 3 years from now, because the texts are already prescribed. And that's not to say that we might not drift back into a series once in a while. I mean, I think that is part of this, because sometimes there is something that comes up or you want to do a specific series on something. But I think primarily, as we've wrestled with this, particularly during this time when things are all kind of in flux, how do we want to proceed going forward? What's going to be best for us, for our congregation? We said, man, what we learned from Immerse and what we've learned in the midst of the last few months has really kind of driven us back to this more ancient pattern. So I'm really excited about that. And you're going to be hearing more about that. You're probably going to be hearing about days on the Christian calendar you never considered before, like rogation days. So I didn't know this. This was something that came up for me. Rogation days are the 3 days of prayer and fasting leading up to Ascension Day. I'd always seen that word. I never knew what it meant. But now I know. So I'm thinking to myself, okay, we're going to do a service on the evening of Ascension Day. I've never done an Ascension Day service before. I've preached on the Ascension, but never done an Ascension Day service. Right. So that's a tremendous opportunity, to do that. And so I'm really looking forward to that. Our devotional guide is going to look a little bit different because of that. It's going to have a little bit more stuff in it, a few more questions, so that if you're journaling or you're meeting with a small group, or if you want to start a small group, this is a great way to do that. Listen to the sermon, read the text during the week, and then you can have a discussion about that. It's really easy. You don't have to do a ton of preparation in order to be able to do that. So it's very accessible, but it's also very much aimed at the heart. What is this saying to me, and how is it going to transform me? How is the proclamation of this word going to transform me? So we're excited about that. Any last words you want to give, Jason, before we wrap up?
I don't think so. I did want to ask you one question, and I don't know, maybe this will get cut out at the end of the podcast and not make it in. but just thinking about, I think this is an interesting Sunday coming up. When you think about the lectionary, you think about the Psalm series that we've been doing, and it's also Aldersgate Sunday. And so it's one of those kind of fortuitous moments. I don't think it always happens with the lectionary, but there are these times where the stars seem to align a little bit to bring everything together. And so I wondered if maybe you might want to just talk for a little bit. I know you did earlier somewhat, but just give us a little preview of Sunday and how just your experience of those things coming together for you.
Yeah, so the Psalm series has been really helpful for me to think through how we pray the Psalms and how we use them, and then also to see how they've been used in someone else's life. And when we look at Aldersgate Day, we always hear the famous thing about Wesley going to Aldersgate Street, a meeting that night where he feels his heart strangely warm as someone is reading Luther's preface to the Epistle to the Romans. So it's not even Romans itself, it's the preface to the Epistle to the Romans that Martin Luther, the great reformer, writes. But Wesley in his journal says that earlier in the day, again, he went to St. Paul's and he heard several scriptures read, but the one that stuck with him was Psalm 130. And he quotes it in its entirety in his journal, in its entirety, which I found fascinating. And it was sung as Psalms are often done. And we were just talking about the fact that Mackenzie Brumman, one of our young adults, did her senior thesis at Notre Dame on psalmody. So we're going to have her on the podcast as well, because she's actually written some songs to connect with the Psalms. So watch for that. I'm excited about getting her on board to do that. We just have to nail down a time to do that.
Yeah.
But this stuck with Wesley, and how that psalm begins, out of the depths I cry to you, O Lord. And then it's the lament is about sin, but then it moves into this beautiful sense of waiting upon the Lord like a watchman waits for the morning, which always takes me back to being on guard duty in the military, waiting all night for the sun to come up, or on observation post or something like that. And so here is Wesley in this dark night of the soul, and he hears that, having come back from America and a failed mission and doubts and struggles, this dark night of the soul, and he hears this psalm sung, and it sticks with him to the point that he writes it all down. And then he goes that night to Aldersgate, and you can almost hear the echo of it still in his soul as he hears, out of the depths I cry. And then he hears Luther's preface, and it's almost like God says, here's the answer. And that's just a powerful moment that I never caught reading Wesley's journal before. I would not have caught that had we not done this series on the Psalms. That pattern of protest, petition, and praise, you see it at work here in Wesley's own heart strangely warmed experience. So I was really excited about preaching that, did the sermon yesterday. I hope it communicates well, because it really hooked me significantly as I was looking at that and thinking, this is what the Psalms, the power of what they can do in the power of the Holy Spirit, how they can speak for us when we don't have words. So I hope you'll tune in on Sunday and listen to that.
Yeah, I think that's powerful. I'm looking forward to it. Appreciate the preview, and I wonder how many people know that we are basically a week ahead at this point. So we're recording on Mondays pretty much so we're a week ahead every single time at this point.
Yeah, it makes it very weird because I don't know what day it is when we do that. And I'll be very excited to get back to preaching on Sunday and Sunday only in front of people. Yeah.
Yeah. And it's so weird to wake up on Sunday morning and just kind of turn on the TV with everyone else and watch it. It's a weird experience. I remember back on Easter Sunday, one of my friends was texting me that things were getting busy at his work and he had to work. And I was like, yeah, we're just going to kind of have a pretty laid back day at the house. And I was like, how weird are things that Easter Sunday was a laid back day for me, and for another person, they had to work that day.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, what I want to say to our people is don't get used to it.
Yeah.
Don't get used to it. Don't get sucked into it. We will be back together at some point here and things will be different, but I'm excited about the possibility of getting back together in whatever form we can. And until there'll probably be an interim period until we can do it for real, the way we have been. But even then, I think it will be somewhat different because there'll be a different sense about wanting to be together in a new way and proclaiming the gospel in that way. So keep watching for that. We'll let you know as we learn more information about, as we make plans. And we certainly appreciate your input. Hope you're all doing well, and we look forward to chatting with you next time here on Between the Lines.